gaming.
Awesome!
There's almost nothing I like more than a good kart racer. RPGs and platformers, sure, those are great too, but if you want to really have some fun, you need go-karts, an assortment of weapons, and a big bunch of characters, preferably from a related video game or cartoon series. And pound for pound, the PS1 has to be considered the king of the kart racers, featuring more in its library than any other console, with some of them being among the best kart racers ever made. But there are also some that quite honestly make my head hurt. So with that in mind, I thought I might as well play a big bunch of PS1 kart racers and let you know which ones are worth playing, and which ones should be hit with a car. So buckle up, you bastards, it's time to go karting!
You want a piece of me? You want some of this?
Let's kick things off with a game that I think most people will agree is among the best kart racers on the PS1, if not the absolute best, and just one of the best kart racers in general, and that's Crash Team Racing, which in terms of its basic gameplay plays it pretty safe. It's very much a Mario Kart clone in that regard, starting you off with 8 playable characters that have different stats for speed, acceleration, and handling, and a bunch of gameplay modes to choose from, including versus races, time trials, a battle mode for up to 4 players, and your standard arcade mode with a series of different cups and multiple difficulty settings. While racing, you can pick up a variety of power-ups and weapons to lob at your opponents, and each track has a unique theme and a bunch of hidden shortcuts. All pretty standard stuff really, but the gameplay is super smooth, the tracks are well designed, and this is just an all-around fun and addictive game. And if that was all there was to it, I'd be more than satisfied with CTR. But on top of all that, we also get an adventure mode, which is very similar to the one in Diddy Kong Racing, with an overworld to drive around in and lots of collectibles to earn. Most importantly being trophies, which you get from winning races obviously. And they function like the balloons in DKR, unlocking more races for you to compete in, ultimately clearing the way to a boss battle in each area. And these can be especially challenging, as each boss has an unlimited supply of whatever their specialty weapon is, but defeating them earns you keys which you need to access the next area. Lastly, after you've cleared a race, you can return to that track to take on a variety of challenges to earn bonus items, such as relics, gems, and coins, which can then unlock even more races and characters. So for a kart racer, there's a hell of a lot to do here, and it'll keep you playing for a good long while. Back in my day, we called that value. Great gameplay aside, this is also a great looking and sounding game, in keeping with the quality that had already been established by the preceding Crash games. There's a wide variety of tracks inspired by locations from the main series, and even though you start out with 8 characters, you can unlock 7 more, bringing the total up to 15, which was a lot for a kart racer at that time. There's also some good Crash-style music to race to, and a bunch of voice work for the various characters as well. So from top to bottom, this is an outstanding game, and it's easy to tell that it was made with a lot of care, intended to be the PlayStation's Mario Kart killer, so to speak. Well, it obviously didn't kill it, but I'd honestly rather play CTR over Mario Kart 64 any day. And if you're not already a fan, I encourage you to give it a try, or perhaps revisit it, because Crash Team Racing is awesome.
Is there a problem, Granny?
From the dizzying highs of Crash Team Racing to the terrifying lows of Nicktoons Racing, this game is such a great example of how important things like smooth controls, a sense of speed, and robust but fair challenge are to a kart racer and racing games in general, because this game is completely lacking in all of those things. It's baffling because on paper this should be a no-brainer. Basically the exact same gameplay as any other kart racer, but featuring Nicktoons characters and tracks inspired by their respective series. That sounds awesome, but unfortunately this game controls like absolute ass, and just has this sheen of cheapness to it. Movement is very stiff, and regardless of which character you're using, they all control very sluggishly. And when playing single player, there's no significant difference between how the CPU characters perform. In most kart racers, some characters will always be in the back of the pack, and some will always be well ahead. But here, everyone is always pretty much clumped up together, and it's anybody's race, which sounds fine, but that means if you get hit by an item, which you definitely will, you can go from first place to last place almost immediately, which obviously gets annoying very quickly. This is definitely a kart racer that relies heavily on items, probably because the racing itself sucks so bad. The one saving grace are certain items that you can pick up to fill up a turbo meter, a gimmick taken from a much better game that we'll look at later. So that at least adds a bit of speed to the gameplay, but overall this game feels slow, sluggish, and it's just kind of boring. Or that is to say, it is when it's not annoying. At least there's a bunch of classic Nicktoons characters to play as, and the tracks are nice and colorful and are also lifted directly from the Nicktoons shows. But they're not particularly exciting to race on. The visuals are fine, but the sound design sucks with really boring generic music, and it didn't take long before I got tired of hearing the same handful of voice clips repeated by each character over and over again. There are only a few gameplay modes to choose from, including arcade and a time trial mode, and oddly enough, I haven't been able to get anyone to play this with me, so I have nothing to say about the multiplayer. There have been a couple of sequels to Nicktoons Racing, with the third game being released on the Nintendo Switch. I featured it in a video a while back, and in short, it's a decent kart racer. Not holding a candle to Mario Kart 8 of course, but being a perfectly serviceable, if somewhat cheap filling game. If you just have to play a Nicktoons kart racing game, I recommend that you play that one. It's okay. As for this game though, avoid it like the plague, because whatever it is, it's certainly not okay.
And what are your feelings about that, Mr. Horse?
No, sir, I don't like it.
Next up, we have a game that I only played for the first time very recently and was honestly shocked by how fun it is. And that's Looney Tunes Racing, which is a pretty damn good game all around. It starts you out with 6 playable characters, including Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Taz, but you can unlock 13 additional characters for a grand total of 19. And in terms of gameplay, the basic mechanics and controls are more or less what you'd expect from a kart racer. But after suffering through Nicktoons Racing, it's so nice to play a game with responsive controls, a decent sense of speed, and well-designed tracks, which by the way are all inspired by classic Looney Tunes cartoons, such as What's Opera Doc and Duck Dodgers in the 21st and a half century. Where this game mixes up the gameplay though is with its weapons. On the left side of the screen you'll see an assortment of items, and by picking up different numbered icons on the track you can access whichever one you want, with the bottom one being a pie that you can throw, basically this game's version of the green turtle shell, and the top item essentially being the equivalent of star power. And in between there are anvils to drop on other racers' heads, bombs to drop on the track, and a lightning cloud, which you don't even need a spear and magic helmet to use. Another cool gimmick is that each track features several multicolored gates that you can drive through to trigger stage hazards further up ahead, giving you yet another opportunity to screw over your opponents, either by dropping a bunch of boulders on their heads or zapping them with lasers. So pretty much throughout the course of each race, there's always something to look out for. So the gameplay ends up being pretty exciting and appropriately loony. There aren't a ton of different gameplay modes to choose from though. You only get your standard championship mode, versus, and single race, but they also threw in a challenge mode that features a whole bunch of different objectives to complete, like time trials and collecting a bunch of items in a limited amount of time. And beating these challenges and clearing the various cups in the championship mode is how you unlock more characters and tracks. Overall, this is a solid playing and very fun kart racer, and it features some pretty decent visuals and sound design too, again with tracks and music directly inspired by the cartoons, and plenty of voice clips for the characters, which, as far as I can tell, were actually recorded just for this game, unlike a certain Nicktoons racer that just recycled a bunch of older clips. Anyway, Looney Tunes Racing was a pleasant surprise, and after playing it for several hours, I'm comfortable saying it's one of the best kart racers on the PS1, and a game that I definitely wouldn't drop an anvil on. Next up, we have a game that kinda broke my heart when I was a kid, and that's South Park Rally. I was such a massive fan of South Park when this game was released in January of 2000, and had even enjoyed the first-person shooter and Chef's Love Shack despite their flaws. But this was one of those games that I rented one weekend, and after about 20 minutes or so of playing it, came to the grim realization that weekend was pretty much in the toilets. And it's really a shame because on paper, a South Park kart racer should be a bit of a no-brainer. And the game even has all the necessary elements to be enjoyable. A bunch of South Park characters to race as? Check. Tracks inspired by locations from the show? Check. An assortment of wacky items and foul-mouthed humor also lifted directly from the show? Double check. The graphics and sound, all things considered, aren't that bad either, and even the basic controls and handling for the karts is at least decent. But for some baffling reason, it was decided that this shouldn't be just a run-of-the-mill kart racer, but instead each track should have an ass-backwards layout, and the parameters for winning should change with each one. So for starters, you have a pretty standard race. That requires you to pass over a series of checkpoints to complete a lap, with there being 3 laps in total, and you must come in first place to progress. But then the shenanigans start. Pick up a trophy and drive it through a bunch of checkpoints. Grab an antidote and hang on to it until a counter next to your character reaches 100%. Grab a bow and arrow and shoot all of the other racers. Or my personal favorite, pick up a pair of Cartman's soiled underwear and run them through a series of checkpoints representing different parts of a wash cycle. What the hell is this? This and this alone ruins South Park Rally. Pretty much every race or event or whatever the hell you want to call them is a total clusterfuck of karts constantly chasing, ramming, shooting, dropping, and picking up whatever item it is for that track. And this gets supremely annoying very quickly, and it's just not fun to play. I guess the developers wanted their kart racer to stand out from the crowd, but this was a horrendous way to do it. It would have already stood out just by virtue of the fact that it's a South Park game. There weren't any other kart racers that let you vomit on your opponents, throw cats at them, and give them herpes. Or at least as far as I know. Although I have my suspicions that Nicktoons Racing actually does carry some kind of STD. Anyway, South Park Rally took what should have been a layup at the peak of South Park's popularity and turned it into a big, steaming turd that is better off forgotten. But be warned, for turds this big, you flush twice.
That has got to be the biggest crap I've ever taken. Hey, Sharon. Sharon, you gotta come see this. Sharon?
What is it, Randy? Do you have any? Oh, Randy!
Will you look at that? Is that the biggest crap you've ever seen or what?
Okay, next up, a little bit of a palate cleanser with Chocobo Racing, which unlike South Park Rally doesn't feature any farts or herpes, but it is jam-packed with plenty of magic spells, mystical creatures, and that certain charm you can only get from a 90s Squaresoft game. It's easy to forget now, but there was a time when Square made more than just Final Fantasy sequels, dipping their toes into racers, shoot-em-ups, and fighting games. But even though the days of Einhander and Bushido Blade are long behind us, doesn't mean we can't reminisce a bit. And I must admit I have a real soft spot for Chocobo Racing, because it's yet another game that demonstrates that pretty much anything can be converted into a kart racer. It features a bunch of characters and creatures from the Final Fantasy series such as the Moogle, Bahamut, and of course the titular Chocobo, plus more to unlock, including Cloud Strife and Ayabraya's police car from Parasite Eve. The racing itself isn't exactly the tightest ever, but it's pretty damn good, and something that I especially like is the item system, which lets you hold up to 3 items at a time, and if you pick up multiples of some of the elemental attacks, you can increase their power up to 3 times, going from an attack that maybe affects one opponent if you can actually hit them, to an attack that'll definitely take out several racers in one fell swoop, which needless to say, is awesome. Also, before you start racing, there are an assortment of special abilities to choose from that you can activate when your special meter is full, and they range from a speed boost and defensive shield, to a magic power increase and temporary flight. So between the items you pick up and your specials, you've always got something to fall back on when the racing is getting heated. Chocobo Racing also features a big bunch of gameplay modes, including Grand Prix, Versus, Time Trials, and a story mode, which plays out like a pop-up book, and this is honestly just cuteness overload. And overall, the game just has a hyper-colorful and cartoonish look that I really like, being more in line with the Chocobo Dungeon series than mainline Final Fantasy. The visuals aren't exactly going to blow anyone away, but they do have a certain charm to them, with the environments being rendered in 3D but the characters being 2D sprites, which looks a little odd at first, but it does make sure that they can be animated and detailed in a way that just wouldn't have been possible if they were also rendered in 3D. And finally, the soundtrack is quite good too, and we're treated to the classic Final Fantasy sound effects, which to this day still touch a nostalgic nerve with me. And overall, while it's not as jam-packed as something like Crash Team Racing, Chocobo Racing is still a hell of a lot of fun and well worth playing for old school Squaresoft fans.
Questo è Chocobo?
Sì, è Chocobo.
Posso guardare?
Solo uno sguardo.
Chocobo!
Il tacchino!
Next up, we have another game that I only just played for the first time very recently, and that's Monster Racer from 2001. And I was hoping that I'd have luck with this one in the same way I did with Looney-Tunes Racing, but unfortunately, it was a big letdown. The premise had me excited, as a kart racer featuring characters modeled after classic horror icons like Dracula, the Mummy, and Frankenstein's monster is something that's right up my alley. But unfortunately, the cool premise is really all this game has going for it, because otherwise it comes off as a very cheap and quickly thrown together game, which was the case with a lot of late era PS1 games, sadly. In terms of gameplay, Monster Racing is about as generic as it gets, featuring very basic gameplay with no frills and some bland looking and frankly boring tracks that at least fit with the monster motif, but they're seriously lacking in detail. And I guess boring is the best word to describe this one. It's just not very fun to play. The controls aren't necessarily horrendous. I've definitely played much worse, as you'll find out later, but it is quite choppy and there's just nothing here to spice up the gameplay. You just sort of chug along in some boring environments while some frankly dogshit generic spooky music is playing, picking up items that do the exact same things that items do in pretty much any other kart racer. And there's not much to speak of in the gameplay modes department either, with an adventure mode which is really just the Grand Prix, except instead of having multiple cups, it makes you race through every track in the game. And there's also an arcade mode which really just lets you choose an individual track to race on. There is a time trial mode included too, but when the base game is so damn lackluster, who honestly gives a shit about a time trial? Also, a reason I'd never heard of this game is because it was a European exclusive, which now makes sense. No need to infect the rest of the world, I guess. Anyway, this is definitely one of the worst kart racers I've ever played, but I later learned that compared to some games, Monster Racer comes out smelling more like a rose and less like a corpse. Next, we have a game that I would have loved to have played when I was a kid because it's based on one of my favorite franchises. But unfortunately, it never saw a release in the US, and that is Mega Man Battle & Chase, which was originally published in Japan in 1997 and had an English version released in 1998, which was later finally made available in North America in 2006 as part of the Mega Man X collection, even though it's not part of the X series. But I didn't complain because in my mind, there couldn't be anything cooler than a Mega Man kart racer. And while it's an admittedly flawed game, I can say that yes, it is indeed pretty damn cool. You have a bunch of different characters to choose from, including the Blue Bomber himself and a couple of his companions, plus a nice mix of robot masters. And as the title implies, Battle & Chase leans heavily into the combat side of kart racing. Each kart comes equipped with a special weapon that can be fired off when fully powered up. And these can be anything from Mega Man's classic Power Shot to Shadow Man's giant shuriken, or Guts Man tossing a huge rock at you. And there are a bunch of other items and weapons to make use of, but the only way to access them is by running over or blasting the little enemies that litter each track. When playing the single player mode, you'll really only be facing off against one primary opponent in each race, as the rest of the field is populated by random cannon fodder enemies from the Mega Man games, and they don't really pose much of a threat. They're just there to get in your way, and in true Mega Man fashion, after defeating an opponent, you can take their powers, or in this case, take a part from their carts that can then be later used to upgrade your kart, increasing its speed, handling, and other abilities. And for the most part, this is really fun. Though admittedly, Battle and Chase is pretty lacking in the gameplay modes department, only featuring Grand Prix, Versus, and Time Attack. But the core gameplay itself is really fun, and at the very least, something unique for a kart racer. And the variety of tracks is quite nice too, with each one featuring different terrains to race on and different stage hazards to contend with. Plus, they are for the most part very colorful and pleasant to look at, with this being a pretty good looking game overall. The soundtrack is also quite good. If you like the music featured in the Mega Man games from around this time, you'll certainly enjoy the music here. And just like with Squaresoft, this game really does just bring me back to a time when Capcom was releasing a wide variety of games and didn't mind taking chances on something new every once in a while. Mega Man Battle and Chase, in short, is a fun and unique kart racing experience that'll put a big smile on the face of any classic Mega Man fan.
Oh no! He's gonna blast President Lincoln!
I knew you'd risk yourself for Mr. Lincoln.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the bottom of the barrel, or at least what I thought was the bottom. This is Rascal Racers, which was released by Telegames in 2004. And if you're saying to yourself, nothing released on the PS1 in 2004 could possibly be anything other than the dirt cheapest, poorest playing garbage available on the platform, you'd be correct, because that's exactly what this is. It's an incredibly cheap looking, horrible playing abomination of a game. You get a big bunch of generic animal characters to play as, and it doesn't matter which one you choose, because they all play the exact same. Which is to say that the controls in this game are some of the most sluggish and unresponsive I've ever come across, and every kart controls like a Sherman tank. So poorly in fact that often not even the CPU knows how to play itself. There are only 3 modes to choose from, those being the standard Grand Prix, Time Attack, and an arcade mode, which in this case just lets you choose an individual track to race on. And if you're someone that sucks at kart racers, you'll be happy to know that in Grand Prix, no matter what position you finish in, you'll always be taken to the next race. So even if you come in dead last, it's no worries. The game doesn't seem to care one way or the other. Anyway, even if this game did control well, it'd still be perhaps the most generic and boring kart racer I've ever played. And apparently there are a bunch more games on the PS1 in this series, where they just swap out the karts for some other kind of vehicle like ATVs and hoverboats. Talk about a racket. The only nice thing I can say about this game is that it actually features some okay music. It's not particularly good, mind you, just like everything else, it's rather cheap and generic sounding, but at least it's not horrible. Rascal Racers on the whole though is, in a word, dog shit. And I thought there was no way I'd come across a worse kart racer than this. But there was another.
This stage just can't get any worse.
This is Extreme Go-Kart Racing from 2003. And with a generic title like that, you know you can't be in for anything good. And make no mistake, this is not only the worst PS1 kart racer, it is to date the worst kart racer I've ever played. Compared to this, games like South Park Rally and Nicktoons Racing are absolute masterpieces. The basic premise is that there aren't any weapons to pick up, but instead canisters that can fill up your turbo gauge. allowing you to, of course, get a quick turbo boost. The problem though is that bumping into anything, and I do mean anything, while using your turbo will cause you to crash and burn. In fact, this often happens anyway from just bumping into another racer. This game is like the anti-kart racer where no contact with your opponents or any surfaces aside from the road itself is allowed at all. Which is a really tall order because I immediately thought that this is perhaps the worst controlling racer I've ever played, not realizing that was the best case scenario of racing on the tarmac. As when you progress to different terrains like dirt and ice, the controls get even worse, to the point where I found this game to be utterly unplayable. I literally could not maintain control of the kart unless I was going as slow as possible. And this is another instance of a game being so bad that even your CPU opponents don't know what the hell is going on. I can't stress this enough, this game is awful in every conceivable way because, as I said, it was released in 2003 and it looks like it could have been a launch title.
It does look like shit.
It just looks cheap as hell and the sound design isn't much better. And I was shocked to learn that it was developed by Now Production, the same developer as Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu and a whole bunch of other great 8 and 16-bit games. What the hell happened to them that this is how far and how fast they fell? It's a real shame because they developed the worst racing game I've ever played or potentially ever will play. Avoid extreme go-kart racing like the plague that it is.
That is one big pile of shit.
Let's not finish this video on a down note though, and instead conclude with what is my personal favorite kart racer on the PS1, and that's 1999 Speed Punks, also known as Speed Freaks outside of the US. And this was a game that had me hooked ever since I first played a demo on one of those PlayStation Underground Jam Packs way back in the day. In many ways, it's a fairly standard kart racer, but it's designed so well and it's so much fun that I hold it in very high regard. Instead of being a mascot racer, it gives you a bunch of original characters to choose from, and they're all pretty damn cool. Being a bunch of eccentric kids hanging out in a treehouse that seemingly just love racing, as well as blasting each other with rockets. They all have varying stats for acceleration, max speed, and handling, and it's worth trying out each one to find your favorite, as they're better suited for different races. And as the name suggests, there's a great sense of speed here, especially because you have a turbo meter that you're constantly depleting and filling back up with power-ups, which is crucial for winning races. And when it's completely full, you get a supercharged turbo boost. And each track is filled with plenty of twists, turns, and some very nifty shortcuts, requiring you to get very familiar with them and mastering the drifting mechanic. And eventually, this does become a pretty challenging game once you've unlocked the more difficult levels in the Grand Prix mode. And speaking of, aside from Grand Prix, there's also a time trial mode, single race, and a versus mode where 2 players race on the same tracks that are in the Grand Prix mode. Or if you have a few friends handy, there's also a multiplayer mode for up to 4 players that features a whole new selection of 12 tracks that are otherwise unavailable. In terms of gameplay, Speed Freaks features a perfect combination of challenge and fun with smooth controls and a great mix of tracks, plus a fun assortment of weapons and wacky characters. It's not as robust of a game as Crash Team Racing, but for just pure racing action, I always reach for Speed Punks. Plus, I've always loved the look of this game. It's very colorful and offers a wide variety of environments to race in, and in general is just a good looking game. And the soundtrack is excellent too, featuring some very upbeat and catchy tunes to race to. For me, this is the peak of PS1 kart racing, and I'm just sad it was one and done. If you've never played it before, I highly recommend Speed Punks, as I think it's not only the best PS1 kart racer, but I'd comfortably put it in my top 5, along with games like Sonic Racing Transformed and the Mario Kart games. In short, it's awesome.
In the racing game Speed Punks, there's a really cool shortcut you can use to beat Cosworth in the Cosworth Challenge. Check it out. From the starting point, race forward along the intended pathway here. and take a sharp right turn along a dirt path. As you approach this ramp, you're going to notice there's some turbos you can pick up. Once you grab them, press R2, jump to this ledge here, and into this waterfall. This is totally opposite the way Cosworth is going, but that's great because you're actually cutting across half the track. Once you exit the little secret area, you'll be right back on the track, right in front of the finish line. There you go. Try it yourself.
And there you have it, everybody. A big bunch of PS1 kart racers. Some of them awesome, and some of them downright awful. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do leave a like if you did, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And why not leave me a comment telling me what's the best kart racer you've ever played, and what's the worst. I'd certainly like to know, and until next time, stay awesome, everybody. Goodbye.